Did you know that one of the biggest war movies ever made almost collapsed before a single camera even started rolling? A Bridge Too Far, released in 1977, tells the true story of Operation Market Garden, one of the boldest and most heartbreaking military plans of the Second World War. Thousands of real soldiers lived this nightmare. And decades later, a brave team of filmmakers tried to bring it back to life. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about A Bridge Too Far. Number 20. The real soldiers were still alive. And watching Imagine making a movie about one of the most painful moments in military history, and then finding out that the men who actually lived through it are sitting right there, watching you film it. That is exactly what happened on the set of A Bridge Too Far. When director Richard Attenborough and his crew began production in the Netherlands, they quickly discovered something remarkable. Many of the veterans who had fought in Operation Market Garden in 1944 were still alive. And not only were they alive, they were close by. Some of them lived in the very towns where the filming was taking place. Some of them walked onto the set. Some of them stood quietly in the background, watching actors pretend to experience things that had once shattered their real lives. For the cast and crew, this created a feeling that was impossible to ignore. There was a strange pressure in the air. Every detail suddenly mattered more. Every uniform had to be right. Every explosion had to feel true. Every line of dialogue carried the weight of a real memory. The actors were not just performing for cameras and audiences. They were performing for the people who had actually been there, men who had buried their friends in those fields, who had crossed those bridges under fire, who had survived things no screenplay could fully capture. Richard Attenborough reportedly felt this pressure deeply. He understood that getting the story wrong would not just be a creative failure. It would be a kind of betrayal. He made a personal promise to himself and to the veterans who trusted him that this film would honor what really happened, even when the truth was painful and complicated and hard to show. Some veterans were even hired as technical advisors. They walked through the locations with the cast members, pointing to spots and saying quietly, "This is where we lost him," or "Right here, everything changed." Those moments were not scripted, they were real. And they changed the way the film was made, from the inside out. What looked like a movie set was actually a place of living memory. Number 19. The budget was staggering. Even by Hollywood standards, here is a number that will make your jaw drop. A Bridge Too Far was made with a budget of approximately $25 million. In 1977, that was an absolutely enormous amount of money for any film. To put it in perspective, most big Hollywood productions at that time cost somewhere between $5 and $12 million. This movie cost more than twice that. It was one of the most expensive films ever made at the time of its release. The reason the budget climbed so high was simple. Everything about the production was massive. The cast alone included some of the biggest names in cinema: Sean Connery, Robert Redford, Dirk Bogarde, Gene Hackman, Anthony Hopkins, Michael Caan, Laurence Olivier, Ryan O'Neal, James Caan, and many others were all brought together for this single film. Each of these actors commanded enormous salaries. Paying all of them at the same time was like trying to host 10 banquets simultaneously. But the cost of the actors was only one part of the problem. The movie also required hundreds of extras, military vehicles, period-accurate uniforms, weapons, and equipment. Real aircraft were needed for the massive parachute drop sequences. Bridges had to be built or modified. Entire streets in Dutch villages had to be transformed to look like they belonged to 1944. All of this required money, enormous amounts of it. The producer, Joseph E. Levine, reportedly raised much of the budget through an unusual method. He pre-sold the international distribution rights to the film before it was even finished. He essentially convinced theaters and distributors around the world to pay for a movie they had not yet seen, based purely on the strength of the cast and the importance of the story. It was a bold gamble, and it worked. Big money, bigger risk, and one of cinema's most ambitious productions. Number 18. Robert Redford only had 4 days to film his part. Robert Redford is one of Hollywood's most iconic actors. His presence in any film is immediately noticed. When he was cast as Major Julian Cook in A Bridge Too Far, audiences were thrilled. Redford was at the absolute peak of his career in the mid-1970s. Everyone expected him to be a major part of the film, and in terms of screen impact, he absolutely was. But here is the part that most people do not know. Robert Redford only spent 4 days on set. That is right. 4 days. His entire performance, including that unforgettable and terrifying scene where soldiers cross the Wall River in flimsy canvas boats under heavy enemy fire, was captured in just 4 days of filming. The reason was purely logistical. Redford had other commitments lined up and could not block out a longer period for the production. His schedule was tightly controlled, and 4 days was all he could offer. The filmmakers had to work around this limitation very carefully. All of Redford's scenes had to be planned, rehearsed, and shot within that tiny window. There was almost no room for mistakes. The river crossing sequence alone required massive coordination, boats, extras playing soldiers, explosions in the water, cameras at multiple angles, and the constant challenge of making everything look chaotic while actually controlling every single element. Redford reportedly pushed himself hard during those 4 days. He trained physically beforehand so that he could handle the demands of the scenes. He wanted to look like a soldier, move like a soldier, and feel like a soldier, even if he only had a fraction of the time that other cast members enjoyed. The result is one of the most gripping sequences in the entire film. 4 days of work that felt like a lifetime of courage. Number 17, real parachutes, real planes, real danger. When you watch the opening parachute sequences in A Bridge Too Far, you are not watching computer effects. You are not watching clever camera tricks. You are watching real human beings jumping out of real aircraft and floating down toward real ground. The filmmakers made a decision very early in production. If this movie was going to honor the men who actually jumped into Holland in 1944, then the parachute sequences had to be authentic. And authentic they were. The production team assembled a remarkable collection of period-accurate aircraft, including Douglas C-47 transport planes. They then coordinated one of the largest civilian parachute drops in post-war history. Hundreds of skydivers and trained parachutists were recruited to recreate the famous mass jump that launched Operation Market Garden. The sky above the Dutch countryside was filled with parachutes, a sight that had not been seen since the actual operation more than 30 years earlier. For the local Dutch communities watching the filming, This was an intensely emotional experience. Many elderly residents stood in fields and on rooftops watching the parachutes descend, and felt memories from 1944 flood back to them. Some reportedly wept. The sight of all those parachutes opening against the sky brought back something they had buried deep inside for decades. Managing the logistics of a real parachute drop was incredibly complicated. Weather conditions had to be perfect. Aircraft had to fly in precise formations. Parachutists had to land in designated zones without injuring themselves or each other. Cameras had to be positioned to capture everything from multiple angles. Safety teams had to be standing by on the ground at all times. There were moments of genuine anxiety. One wrong gust of wind could send a parachutist off course. But remarkably, the sequences were completed without serious injury. Real skies, real courage, real history falling from the clouds. Number 16. The Bridge That Refused to Cooperate. The title of the film refers to the famous bridge at Arnhem, the bridge that Allied forces tried desperately to capture and hold during Operation Market Garden. It is one of the most iconic bridges in military history, and when the filmmakers decided to recreate the battle scenes around it, they ran into a problem that nobody had anticipated. The real bridge at Arnhem was no longer there in the same form. It had been rebuilt after the war, and it now looked too modern to appear in a 1944 story. The production team had to find a solution. After extensive searching, they located a bridge in the town of Deventer in the Netherlands that was structurally similar to the original Arnhem Bridge and old enough to pass as a period-accurate location. This became the primary filming location for the famous bridge sequences. Huge amounts of work went into dressing the bridge and its surrounding streets to look like wartime Arnhem. Sandbags, rubble, period vehicles, and damage that had been carefully added by the art department. But even this substitute bridge caused problems. Filming on and around a real functioning bridge is enormously complicated. Traffic had to be managed. Safety barriers had to be erected and then disguised by the set dressers. Explosions had to be carefully controlled so that they looked devastating on camera but caused no actual structural damage. The engineering required to make all of this work safely was genuinely impressive. And yet, despite all these challenges, the bridge scenes carry an authenticity that feels almost overwhelming when you watch them. The narrow streets, the crumbling buildings, the desperate soldiers, it all looks and feels real. What the real bridge refused to give, another bridge quietly provided. Number 15. Anthony Hopkins refused to leave the set. Anthony Hopkins plays Lieutenant Colonel John Frost in A Bridge Too Far, the British officer who leads his battalion to the Arnhem Bridge and then holds it against impossible odds for days. It is one of Hopkins's finest performances. Strong, dignified, quietly heartbreaking. And it turns out that Hopkins threw himself into this role with a kind of intensity that surprised even the people working around him. Hopkins reportedly became deeply absorbed in the character of Frost. He researched the real John Frost extensively, reading accounts, studying photographs, and trying to understand not just what Frost did, but who he was as a human being. The real Frost was still alive during the production, which added another layer of responsibility to the performance. Hopkins knew that the actual man might one day watch him on screen, and he did not want to let him down. During the intense battle sequences filmed around the bridge, Hopkins is said to have shown remarkable stamina. Long shooting days, physical discomfort, cold temperatures, smoke, noise, and the chaos of crowd scenes with hundreds of extras, none of it seemed to drain him. In fact, witnesses on set recall that Hopkins seemed to draw energy from the difficulty of the scenes. The harder things got, the more focused he became. There is a specific quality to his performance in this film that is different from his later, more famous work. There is a rawness to it, a sense that he is holding something back just barely, the way a real soldier might hold back grief and fear in front of his men. Not just acting. It looked like he really was John Frost. Number 14. Cornelius Rhine's book was the foundation, and A Warning Before a Bridge Too Far was a movie. It was a book. Cornelius Rhine, an Irish-American journalist and author, spent years researching and writing the definitive account of Operation Market Garden. His book, published in 1974, was based on interviews with more than 1,000 people, soldiers, civilians, nurses, commanders, and survivors from both sides of the battle. It was meticulous, emotionally honest, and deeply human. When producer Joseph E. Levine decided to adapt the book for the screen, Ryan was already seriously ill with cancer. Despite his illness, Ryan was involved in the early stages of the film's development. He cared deeply about how the story would be told. He had spent years listening to the people who survived this operation, and he felt a profound responsibility to represent their experiences faithfully. The screenplay was written by William Goldman, one of Hollywood's most celebrated screenwriters, responsible for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and many others. Goldman faced an enormous challenge. Ryan's book was dense, layered, and filled with dozens of separate storylines happening simultaneously across different locations. Condensing all of that into a single film without losing the human detail was an almost impossible task. Goldman has spoken in interviews about how difficult this adaptation was. He made hard choices about which stories to include and which to leave out. Every cut meant someone's experience was left untold. But he also understood that a film has to move, breathe, and focus in a way that a book does not. Cornelius Rhine passed away in 1974, the same year his book was published, before the film was completed. The movie carries his spirit in every frame. One man's years of listening became a world's 2 hours of watching. Number 13. Gene Hackman learned Polish for his role. Gene Hackman is not the first name you might expect to find in a Second World War epic about British and American soldiers fighting in the Netherlands. But Hackman plays Polish General Stanislaw Sosabowski, the commander of the Polish Parachute Brigade, who warned Allied commanders that Operation Market Garden was too risky and was largely ignored. It is a fascinating and tragic role. To prepare for the part, Hackman made an effort that genuinely impressed the cast and crew around him. He began learning basic Polish phrases so that his character would feel authentic. He also worked hard to develop a convincing Polish accent in English, not an easy task, particularly for an American actor more famous for playing tough American characters. The choice to cast an American actor as a Polish general was controversial at the time. Some critics felt that a Polish actor should have been given the role, but Hackman's performance silenced many of those concerns. He brought a powerful dignity to Sosabowski, a man who was right when everyone else was wrong, and who paid a heavy price for speaking the truth to people who did not want to hear it. The real Sosabowski had been stripped of his command after the operation. Unfairly blamed for failures that were not his fault, he spent years fighting to clear his name. Hackman understood this injustice and built it into his performance in subtle but affecting ways. There is a scene late in the film where Sosabowski's expression communicates something that no dialogue could say, the quiet devastation of a man who watched his warnings go unheeded. He was right all along. Nobody wanted to hear it. Number 12. The production employed over 250,000 extras. This number sounds impossible. It feels like an exaggeration. But it is one of the most remarkable production facts about A Bridge Too Far. The film employed somewhere in the range of 250,000 people across its entire production period, including extras, crowd participants, and local citizens involved in various scenes. The scale of this human coordination was unlike almost anything that had been attempted in cinema before. Many of these participants were Dutch citizens, local people from the very towns and villages where the filming was taking place. This gave the crowd scenes a very specific energy that you cannot manufacture. These were people filming in their own streets, sometimes in front of their own houses, recreating events that their parents and grandparents had actually witnessed. The emotional investment of the crowd was genuine. They were not just being paid to stand in the background. They were participating in a story that belonged to their community. Managing this many people on a film production is a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. Costume departments had to outfit huge numbers of extras in period-accurate clothing. Catering teams had to feed enormous groups of people across multiple locations simultaneously. Transportation, communication, and safety coordination were all pushed to their absolute limits. Assistant directors reportedly communicated through elaborate relay systems, passing instructions from department to department, person to person, across distances that would have been impossible to manage any other way. Walkie-talkies, hand signals, runners, everything was used to keep the massive production moving. 250,000 people, one story, one impossible mission. Number 11. Sean Connery almost did not join the film. Sean Connery was, at the time of A Bridge Too Far, one of the most recognizable men on the planet. His face was famous in every country that had a cinema. Getting him to appear in the film was a major coup for the production. He plays Major General Roy Urquhart, the British commander of the 1st Airborne Division, the man responsible for the Arnhem operation that ended in catastrophe. It is a serious, heavy role, far removed from the action hero glamour that Connery was famous for. But getting Connery to say yes was not simple. He was selective about his projects and very careful about his schedule. The negotiations reportedly took considerable time and effort. When he finally agreed to join the production, the relief among the filmmakers was enormous. His involvement also gave the film additional prestige and helped secure the massive budget it needed. What is interesting about Connery's performance is how much he tones himself down. There is no charm offensive, no flash, no easy magnetism. He plays Urquhart as a burdened man, someone who understands he is watching a disaster unfold and cannot stop it. The restraint in the performance is actually quite remarkable, especially coming from an actor so naturally charismatic. Connery also took the research aspect of the role seriously. He read accounts of the real Urquhart's experience and tried to understand the psychological weight of commanding men in a situation that was deteriorating beyond anyone's control. The most famous spy in cinema history became a general trapped in a beautiful nightmare. Number 10. The Dutch government provided extraordinary cooperation, making a film that recreates the Second World War liberation of the Netherlands is not a small request to make of a government. Yet when the filmmakers approached Dutch authorities about using real towns, roads, rivers, and landmarks for the production, they received a level of cooperation that was genuinely extraordinary. The Dutch government understood the importance of this story. Operation Market Garden was a pivotal moment in Dutch history. The liberation of the southern Netherlands and the failed attempt to liberate the north are events that remain deeply meaningful to Dutch culture. Having a major international film honor that history was seen as something worth supporting fully. Military equipment was made available. Police departments helped manage road closures and crowd control. Local authorities worked with the production team to transform streets and public spaces into period locations. The level of civic involvement was remarkable. In some cases, entire neighborhoods cooperated with the filming over extended periods. The relationship between the production and the Dutch communities was also deeply personal. Many residents did not see this simply as a film shoot happening in their town. They saw it as an act of remembrance. Veterans attended. Families of fallen soldiers visited the sets. Local school children sometimes watched from behind barriers, learning about something that had happened in their own streets before they were born. This cooperation gave the film something that money alone cannot buy: a sense of place, of truth, of belonging to a real story. The Netherlands did not just lend its streets, it lent its heart. Number 9. James Caan convinced Richard Attenborough to cast him. James Caan was not originally considered for a role in A Bridge Too Far. He is one of those facts that surprises people who love this film, because his presence feels so right in retrospect. He plays Staff Sergeant Eddie Dohan, a soldier who risks everything to get medical help for a wounded superior officer in one of the film's most emotionally powerful subplots. But getting into the film required Caan to fight for his spot. The story goes that Caan personally reached out to director Richard Attenborough and expressed his strong desire to be part of the production. He was passionate about the subject matter and felt genuinely connected to the story of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things under impossible pressure. Attenborough, impressed by Caan's enthusiasm and commitment, found him a role. The sequence that Caan's character drives through, literally driving a jeep through a battlefield, weaving between explosions and enemy fire to save his colonel, is one of the most visceral and human moments in the entire film. It cuts through all the grand military strategy and reminds the audience that at the center of every battle plan, there are individual human beings who are terrified and brave at the same time. Caan reportedly trained intensively for the physical demands of his scenes. He wanted to bring an authenticity to the raw emotion of the character, a man acting on instinct and love rather than orders and strategy. He was not invited. He invited himself, and the film is better for it. Number 8. Richard Attenborough felt the film was his most difficult challenge. Richard Attenborough directed some of the most ambitious films in British cinema history. But in interviews throughout his life, he frequently referred to A Bridge Too Far as one of the most demanding and emotionally exhausting experiences of his career. And given that this is the same man who later directed Gandhi, one of the most celebrated biographical films ever made, that is saying something profound. The sheer scale of the production was overwhelming. Managing dozens of major stars, thousands of extras, multiple locations across an entire country, complex action sequences, period-accurate details, and the emotional weight of a true tragedy. All of this placed demands on Attenborough that tested him in every possible way. He has spoken about the loneliness of directing a film like this. When you are responsible for everything, when every decision rests with you, when hundreds of people are looking to you for guidance every single day, the pressure can become almost unbearable. Attenborough described moments during production where he felt genuinely uncertain about whether the film was coming together the way he had imagined it. There were also creative pressures. The story of Operation Market Garden is not a simple heroic narrative. It is a story about failure, brilliant, brave, determined men who tried something impossible and paid a devastating price. Finding the right tone, one that honored the courage without glorifying the catastrophe, required constant, careful judgment. He carried the weight of thousands of real lives on his shoulders, every day, every shot, every cut. Number 7. The film was controversial among military historians. When A Bridge Too Far was released in 1977, it was both praised and criticized, sometimes by the very same people. Military historians and veterans were divided in their reactions. Many praised it as the most authentic and honest depiction of Operation Market Garden ever put on screen. Others argued that it was unfair in how it portrayed certain commanders, particularly the British and American generals responsible for the planning of the operation. The film does not shy away from criticizing the strategic decisions that led to the disaster. It shows generals dismissing warning signs, ignoring intelligence reports, and making optimistic assumptions that had fatal consequences for thousands of men. For some, this was brave and honest filmmaking. For others, it felt like a selective reading of history that was unfair to men who were doing their best under incredibly difficult circumstances. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who championed Operation Market Garden, was depicted in the film through implication rather than direct portrayal. His strategic vision or overconfidence, depending on your perspective, is present throughout the story. Some of his defenders felt the film unfairly blamed him for a plan that might have worked under different circumstances. What makes A Bridge Too Far unusual for a war film of its era is that it refuses to end on a note of triumph. The operation fails. The men who fought so hard are forced to retreat or surrender or die. The film holds this painful truth in front of the audience without flinching. Sometimes the truth makes everyone uncomfortable, including the people it honors. Number 6. The music was composed under extreme time pressure. The score for A Bridge Too Far was composed by John Addison, a British composer who had won an Academy Award for his work on Tom Jones in 1963. His music for A Bridge Too Far is beautiful and deeply moving, marching rhythms that speak of duty and order, combined with mournful undertones that carry the sadness of what is unfolding on screen. What most people do not know is that Addison composed this score under enormous time pressure. The post-production schedule for a film of this size was extremely compressed. Editing alone was a massive undertaking. There were hours upon hours of footage to sort through, multiple storylines to weave together, hundreds of scenes to sequence and refine. By the time the editing was sufficiently finished for the music to be written, Addison had very little time to produce what needed to be an emotionally sophisticated and orchestrally complex score. He worked quickly and under pressure, but the results were extraordinary. The main theme of the film is one of those melodies that feels both heroic and heartbreaking at the same time. It captures something specific about the tragedy of Operation Market Garden, men who were brave enough to try the impossible, even when the impossible was already killing them. The orchestral recording sessions were conducted at speed, with musicians working through the material as efficiently as possible, yet listening to the finished score. You would never guess that it was produced under anything other than calm, controlled, unhurried conditions, created in a rush, felt for a lifetime. Number 5. Laurence Olivier filmed his scenes. While seriously ill, Laurence Olivier is one of the greatest actors in the history of the English language. His career spanned decades and included some of the most celebrated performances ever committed to film and stage. By the time he appeared in A Bridge Too Far, Olivier was in his late 60s and suffering from a series of serious illnesses that had plagued him through the 1970s. He plays Dr. Jan Sponder, a Dutch physician caught in the middle of the battle for Arnhem. It is not a large role in terms of screen time, but Olivier invests it with a kind of quiet authority that only he could bring. Every moment he is on screen carries weight. What is remarkable and deeply moving when you know it is that Olivier filmed his scenes while dealing with significant physical suffering. He had been battling dermatomyositis, a serious muscle disease, among other health problems. The physical demands of film work were genuinely difficult for him at this point in his life. And yet he showed up. He performed. He delivered. Those who worked with him on set reportedly found the experience both inspiring and sobering. Here was one of the most celebrated artists in history, clearly not at full physical strength, yet still bringing complete professional focus and emotional intelligence to every take. Younger cast members watched him and felt humbled. Olivier's scenes have a tenderness to them, a gentleness that perhaps reflects not just the character, but the man himself at that stage of his remarkable life. The greatest actor in the world showed up, even when the world did not expect him to. Number 4. The film nearly bankrupted its producer. Joseph E. Levine was the producer who made A Bridge Too Far happen. He was a legendary figure in Hollywood, a man famous for his bold instincts, his showmanship, and his willingness to take enormous financial risks on ambitious projects. And with A Bridge Too Far, he took the biggest risk of his career. The film cost approximately $25 million to make. Levine raised much of this money himself through pre-sales and personal financial commitments. He bet heavily on the film's commercial success. When it was released in the summer of 1977, it faced unexpected competition. That same summer saw the release of Star Wars, a film that changed the movie industry forever and pulled enormous amounts of audience attention and box office money in a direction nobody had predicted. A Bridge Too Far did reasonably well at the box office, but it did not perform at the level that its enormous budget required. The financial returns, while respectable for almost any other film, were not sufficient to fully cover the costs and investment that had been poured into the production. Levine reportedly suffered significant financial losses. The irony is painful. He created a film of genuine historical and artistic importance, a film that has grown in reputation over the decades and is now considered one of the definitive war movies of its era. But the timing of its release and the arrival of a little science fiction film about a galaxy far, far away cost him dearly. He built something magnificent. The universe had other plans that summer. Number 3. Many scenes were shot in the exact locations where the real events occurred. This is one of the most haunting facts about A Bridge Too Far. The filmmakers did not just try to find locations that looked like the places where Operation Market Garden was fought. In many cases, they actually filmed in the exact same places where real soldiers had fought, bled, and died in 1944. The fields outside Arnhem, the streets of Nijmegen, the roads along which Allied vehicles had pushed forward, the riverbanks where soldiers crossed under fire. These were not reconstructed or replicated. They were the actual places. And in some of those places, the ground itself still held traces of the battle. Unexploded ordnance was occasionally discovered during location preparation. Soil disturbed by heavy equipment sometimes revealed fragments of the war just beneath the surface. For the cast members who knew this history, filming in these real locations was a deeply unsettling and moving experience. Anthony Hopkins has spoken about standing in streets in Arnhem and feeling the presence of the men who had fought there. Sean Connery reportedly took quiet walks through some of the locations before filming began, alone, simply absorbing where he was and what had happened there. The Dutch communities who hosted the filming felt this connection most acutely. For them, every location was not just a picturesque backdrop. It was a place of memory, a place where someone's father or grandfather had fought, where neighbors had hidden in cellars, where the noise of battle had once filled every corner of daily life. The ground remembered. The film just helped the world remember too. Number 2. The film ends with a quote that changes everything. There is a moment near the very end of A Bridge Too Far that stops many viewers completely. After all the noise and chaos and tragedy, after all the heroism and failure and grief, the film delivers a single line of dialogue that reframes everything you have just witnessed. When a British officer explains to a local Dutch citizen what has happened, that the operation has failed, that the Allied forces are retreating, that the liberation of Arnhem has not been achieved, the Dutch man responds with quiet, devastated clarity. He says simply that it was not their bridge. It was a bridge too far. This line, which gives the film its title and echoes the famous remark attributed to Field Marshal Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, hits differently at the end of the film than it would at any other point. By the time you hear it, you have spent nearly 3 hours watching thousands of men pour everything they have into an impossible mission. You have watched them be brave and terrified and confused and determined. You have watched them die. And then those few words, simple, quiet, devastating, arrive and tell you everything. The whole catastrophe, summarized in a single breath, the gap between ambition and reality, the cost of being just a little too hopeful. Richard Attenborough reportedly spent considerable time deciding exactly where and how to place this moment in the film. He understood that it had to land perfectly, not with drama or emphasis, but quietly, like a stone dropping into still water. A few words at the end. The whole weight of the war. Number 1. The film changed how war movies tell the truth before a bridge too far. Most major war films followed a familiar pattern. Heroes emerged. Battles were won. Courage was rewarded. Even films that showed the horror of war tended to frame it within a larger narrative of ultimate victory or meaningful sacrifice. The darkness was always balanced by some form of light at the end. A Bridge Too Far broke that pattern in a way that was genuinely radical for its time. It is a film about a famous military failure, a plan that was too ambitious, executed at the wrong time, against odds that should never have been accepted. The Allied forces in this film are brave and committed and human, but they lose. Genuinely and completely and heartbreakingly lose. And the film does not soften this or redeem it or wrap it in consoling meaning. This was shocking to audiences in 1977. War films were supposed to be about courage leading to triumph. A Bridge Too Far insisted on telling the truth instead, that sometimes courage leads only to a better understanding of what has been lost. The impact of this choice rippled through the decades that followed. Directors who came after Attenborough cited this film as an influence on their own willingness to show war without heroic resolution. It helped create space for later films that took equally unflinching approaches to the realities of combat, films that trusted their audiences to sit with tragedy rather than needing to be rescued from it. In the history of war cinema, this film asked a question that nobody wanted to ask. Was it worth it? The most honest films are always the ones that dare to ask the questions with no comfortable answers. Bonus fact, the secret screening that almost nobody knows about. Here is something that very few people who love A Bridge Too Far have ever heard about. Before the film was officially released to the public in 1977, there was a special screening arranged for a very particular audience. The film was shown privately to a group that included surviving veterans of Operation Market Garden, men who had actually parachuted into Holland in 1944, men who had fought at the bridges and in the streets and in the fields that the film depicted. This screening was organized with great care and some anxiety. The filmmakers understood that these men would be watching with eyes and hearts that no ordinary audience could possess. They would know immediately if something was wrong, if a uniform was inaccurate, if a piece of dialogue rang false, if the emotional truth of a moment was missing. And more than that, they would be watching their own lives, their own memories, their own losses projected onto a large screen by people who had never experienced any of it. The atmosphere in the screening room was reportedly very still, very quiet. These were not young men. They had carried the memories of Market Garden for more than 30 years by this point. Some of them had never spoken about their experiences in detail. Some of them had friends whose names were on memorial walls. Watching the film together in that room was something beyond what words can easily describe. After the screening, Richard Attenborough reportedly met with some of the veterans. He was nervous. He needed to know what they thought, not because he needed their approval exactly, but because he had promised himself that the film would honor them, and he could not know whether he had kept that promise until he looked these men in the eyes. By most accounts, The response from the veterans was deeply moving. Many of them felt that the film had told the truth. Not a perfect truth, not a complete truth, because no film can contain all of that, but an honest truth. A truth that recognized their courage without pretending the operation was something other than what it was. A truth that said clearly and without apology that these men had been asked to do something impossible and had done it anyway, as far as human beings possibly could. One veteran was reported to have said something very simple after the screening. He said that he had waited 30 years for someone to show people what it was really like. Not the glory, not the victory, just what it was really like, and that this film had done that. That single sentence from a man who had lived through the real thing might be the most meaningful review A Bridge Too Far ever received. Old memories brought back to life with honesty and care. A Bridge Too Far is not just a war movie. It is a story about what happens when human beings reach beyond what is possible and what it costs them. It is about the space between a brilliant plan and a brutal reality. It is about the men and women who live inside history while the rest of the world makes plans around them. The film was made by people who cared deeply, a director who felt the weight of real lives on his shoulders, actors who researched and prepared and gave everything, a Dutch nation that opened its streets and its memories, and veterans who trusted strangers with their most painful stories. Decades after its release, A Bridge Too Far remains one of cinema's most honest accounts of what war actually looks like from the inside. Not triumphant, not clean, but human. Deeply, painfully, courageously human. These 20 facts and the bonus story are just small windows into something much larger. The full story belongs to the people who lived it. This film, and every honest film like it, simply tries to keep their memory alive for a little longer. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we will keep uncovering them, one story at a time.